Hello everybody, and thank you for tuning in again. This is your second sample question dealing with spouses, common law partners, and conjugal partners as it relates to your upcoming ICCRC Full Skills Exam. Now this question here is going to touch on quite a few of the elements we spoke about during the lesson that you saw. With this one here, you want to pay special attention to recognition of the marriage in both countries. Also with this one here, you have to remember to take a look and just remember one of those commonalities that goes across a lot of the elements of immigration as it relates to the full skills exam, and that is when PR begins. So we're going to take a look at these two elements in the context of a question that you might face on the full skills exam. Alright, so I'm really happy and excited to get to the question, so let's jump right in. Alright, so here we have Mark. Now Mark is a Canadian and Robert are a gay couple who live in Zimbabwe and have been living together for the past 3 years. Although gay marriage is illegal in Zimbabwe, there is a church in their city which conducts weddings for same-sex couples and issues marriage certificates that are recognized in South Africa but not Zimbabwe. Mark and Robert were married in this church 8 months ago, and unfortunately Mark has been transferred back to the Canadian branch of his company. As such, he would like to sponsor Robert as his accompanying spouse, but doesn't know where to begin. What would you advise Mark in this situation? A. Mark would sponsor Robert as his common law partner and PR status would be obtained in Zimbabwe. B. Mark would sponsor Robert as his spouse and PR status would be obtained in Zimbabwe. So you can see the only difference between the two there is which area he would sponsor him under. So it would be common law or spouse. Let's take a look at C. So C says Mark would sponsor Robert as his common law partner, as we saw before, and PR status would be obtained upon the couple's arrival in Canada. And finally, D. Mark would sponsor Robert as his spouse, and PR status would be obtained upon the couple's arrival in Canada. Alright, so a pretty tricky little question here. And if you want to answer this on your own, of course, press pause. Remember that this question is dealing with recognition of the marriage, also sponsoring a spouse from outside of the country, and of course when and where the PR status would begin. Alright, so you can press pause right now and we're going to move on. Okay, so when we're looking at this, we could see that this question itself, the scenario itself, is a bit smaller than some of the other ones that we make in these videos here. But you can see that doesn't mean that it's less important. You can see that just about every single little piece in this story of Mark and Robert is important. So you have the status of Mark as being Canadian, you have them as being a gay couple, and they live together. So they talk about the legality of the marriage and just the marriage that they went through. Okay, we have the intent as well near the end. So Mark is moving back to Canada, he's being transferred back to Canada. And we have Robert, who he would like to sponsor. So these are all the important elements that we need to take a look at when we're trying to decipher which one is the correct answer. Now, when we take a look again at those important pieces of information in the context of the entire question, we're going to go through this, as we always do, step by step. So this is similar to another question that we saw in the family class where you have two answers that are similar. really. So A and B are pretty similar. The only difference is which way he would apply under. So would it be common law or spouse? And then we have the second part of those answers, which state that the permanent resident status would be obtained in Zimbabwe. Now we have C and D, which are very similar as well, in that they say that the status would be obtained in Canada, but the way of sponsoring the partner would be different. So we have common law versus spouse in that one as well. All right, so let's take a look at the potential answers here. All right, so we're going to take a look at A and B together. Now, the question itself is whether or not Mark can sponsor Robert as a spouse, common law, or conjugal partner. Now, you can probably tell just from the options that they give us with the answers that conjugal partner is not even an element in the question. If you remember the definition of a conjugal partner, you'll know right away that Mark and Robert do not qualify as conjugal partners because they're obviously together. All right, so we're taking a look at A and B first. Now, the commonality between those two is that the PR status would be obtained in Zimbabwe. The difference is basically that in A, Mark would sponsor Robert as a common law partner, and in B, Mark would sponsor Robert as his spouse. So when we take a look at those general requirements that we spoke about in the previous video, we can see that just as a very basic requirement under Regulation 131, a sponsor must be a Canadian citizen, which we saw before, or permanent resident who's 18, resides in Canada, has filed a sponsorship application. But there's a little tiny caveat here. When we go off to number 2, and we can see that a sponsor doesn't actually have to reside in Canada when they are sponsoring, except they have to live in Canada when the foreign national becomes a permanent resident. So with this one here, we can see that both A and B would be incorrect, because Robert would not obtain his permanent resident status in Zimbabwe, because, as we can see here, the sponsor would have to reside in Canada, of course, when the foreign national becomes a permanent resident. All right, so from understanding Regulation 130, you eliminated 50% of the options really waiting for you. So that again shows you how important it is to have a really great understanding of the family class as a whole, because that theme could play a role in pretty much any question regarding spouses, common law partners, conjugal partners, and dependent children. And we talked about how common spouse, common law, conjugal questions are in the exam. So remember, this is a really big deal. All these little tiny details will help you in passing the full skills exam. All right, so let's take a look at C and D now. So we can see here that C and D are essentially the same question, or the same answers really, in terms of when Robert would obtain his permanent resident status. So Robert, as we saw before, would obtain his permanent resident status once he arrives in Canada, as long as Mark is with him or living in Canada at that time, of course. Now the difference is whether or not Robert would be sponsored as a common law partner or as a spouse. All right, so we saw again in Regulation 130 that Mark would have to reside in Canada, of course, when Robert's permanent resident status is obtained. But let's dig into this a little bit deeper by exploring the differences between what is a common law partner and what is a spouse. Okay, so when we take a look again at that scenario, we can see that they talk about the legality of their gay marriage or same-sex marriage. So we can see that it's illegal in Zimbabwe, but when we take a look again at those main requirements, as we saw before, in terms of a same-sex partner being sponsored as a spouse, common law partner, conjugal partner, pretty much everything's the exact same as if it were a spouse, maybe a husband sponsoring a wife, or a wife sponsoring a husband. So for same-sex partners, a husband sponsoring a husband, a wife sponsoring a wife, it's all pretty much the exact same thing. The only difference is over here, really. So remember, of course, a sponsor has to be a citizen or permanent resident of Canada. In terms of sponsoring with marriage, if they were married in Canada, they would obviously have to have a marriage certificate granted by a Canadian province or territory. For Mark and Robert, we could see that even though Mark's Canadian, they weren't married in Canada. Instead, they were married in Zimbabwe in what seems like an unofficial sort of wedding. But that's where this one comes in. So if the couple is married in a different country, remember that the marriage has to be legally recognized. In this case, it would be in Zimbabwe and, of course, in Canada. Now, as we can see over here, that marriage is illegal in Zimbabwe. So even though obviously gay marriage is perfectly legal in Canada, in all the provinces in Canada, in Zimbabwe it's illegal. So in terms of immigration, we need to think a little bit differently here. So when we're looking at spouses, actually, even though it's perfectly normal in Canada for a gay couple to get married, and of course it's legal, in Zimbabwe it's illegal. So in the eyes of immigration, Mark would not be able to sponsor Robert as a spouse. Now let's just clarify this a little bit more by looking at restricted relationships. So we're going to see that actually this isn't a restricted relationship for the most part, other than one little thing. And it's just what we saw before. So we can see that it doesn't appear anyways that either party here is under 18. And in the context of the question and the answers that they provide to us, it doesn't actually matter, so it doesn't really play a role. Same thing with the genuine relationship. There's no mention at all in the scenario of this not being a genuine relationship, so we wouldn't worry about it too much. There's no mention of the sponsorship bar. What is, of course, noticeable in the story is that the marriage is not legal in the foreign country. So we're taking a look at number 4. We could see that in the scenario here. So with this, we're left with C as the only option. And this is going to happen in your exam quite a bit, where you're going to be really choosing between two answers. And we talk about this in the seminar quite a bit on strategies to overcome this obstacle. But for this lesson here, let's just take a look at C, and we'll explore this just so that you can be 100% confirmed about your answer. So now we need to really confirm whether or not they are actually in a common law relationship. When we look at this, of course, in the context of the answer that we're exploring, it doesn't really matter actually, just because we know that C is the only option left. But just so that you can be 120% confirmed that C is the perfect, beautiful answer, let's compare if they actually have what would be considered a common law relationship in the eyes of immigration law. So if you remember from the previous lesson, we talked about how a common law relationship is a marriage-like relationship with a minimum of 12 months cohabitation. And the little tip I gave you before, I think really helps you in answering this question. So this couple here, I mean, they're married really. Just in the eyes of immigration, that marriage would not be valid just because it happens to be illegal in the country that they are currently residing in. Okay, they're not a boyfriend sort of thing. It's a serious marriage-like relationship. So when you explore this one here, which is a scenario, and you're comparing that to Regulation 117.1 or Regulation 131, and those court cases that are at the bottom of the webpage here at www.fullskillsexamprep.com, then you can see that this is certainly a marriage-like relationship. And again, just to help you really drive home this point, because it's a pretty good topic for you to understand in terms of your full skills exam. And that is, of course, what is a common law relationship versus what is a spouse versus what is a conjugal partner, and what do they need to prove in order to immigrate as a common law partner. So if you remember from before, we had this big list of items that can be used to prove this. So we can see that they've been living together. There's no real mention of them sharing electricity bills and that kind of thing. But just to, again, reinforce this knowledge in you in studying this topic, remember that basically in a marriage, people will share bank accounts and electricity bills and that kind of thing. And remember that a common law relationship is almost the exact same thing as a marriage. So in order to prove this relationship, they would have to prove all those marriage-like things. Okay, so if you got C in this one here right away from the start, a very big congratulations to you. In exploring this question a little bit deeper, we talk about a few elements that pop up in here in the seminar. So if you're interested in the ability to look through these questions a little bit more, I would very strongly recommend you take the seminar. And it'll help you, again, just to be able to really look through these questions, really analyze them, and really help you go in the right direction in answering this type of question. All right, so thank you for tuning in. I really value your time. I know how busy everybody is, but it's really great you're going through these questions, and I look forward to talking with you in the next video.